And the first thing I want to share with you is the US national debt clock. So Janet Yellen came out, I think it was today, your time in the States, and said that the US is going to run out of money by the 1st of June if they don't raise the national debt ceiling. So, if you don't know, folks, the national debt ceiling has been raised in the United States more than 100 times since World War II. So, the US national debt ceiling, those words are actually a bit of an oxymoron because the ceiling denotes that it's not going to go any higher. That's as high as it's actually going to go. So, I find that a bit of a funny statement there. It doesn't really make any sense. If you've never seen this before, this is the running total of US national debt. And if you can't wrap your brain around the numbers there, let me help you. So the first number here where my mouse is 31 trillion, 721 billion, 103 million, 730, 40, 50, $60,000. That's how much debt the US actually has. So what does that actually mean? And why is the country running out of money? Well, what you can do is just look over here to the right-hand side where my mouse is here, where it says total debt to GDP ratio. So if you don't know, folks, GDP is gross domestic product. So how much debt does a country have versus how much money does it bring in? So if a country had, say, $10 billion worth of debt, but they had revenues of $50 billion, what you do is you take 10 divided by 50 and you times it by 100, and that's what you get as the debt to GDP ratio. Now, the IMF say that debt to GDP ratio should be below 60%. So there's no real hard and fast number because there's more numbers in the economy that make up an economy than just debt to GDP. But if you're below 60%, it seems like you're going to be less impacted by an economic shock if that happens. And so that's why they say that. If you're around 40% debt to GDP ratio, it says that you're in a really, really strong position. Your country is able to weather the storms. So these numbers here on the right-hand side are the really interesting numbers to look at, not so much the total amount. Well, that's important, of course, but the debt to GDP ratio matters. So it means that there's 133.98, so 134%, call it, more debt than there is actual money coming in. So the spending to GDP ratio, so only 37% of government spending is spent on government services. The other 73% of it, or 63% of it rather, is spent on servicing this debt. So that is a really scary proposition because it means the country is running out of money. It's like you're using a credit card to pay off another credit card, and there's literally nothing that you could do. Eventually your credit card limit is going to, so if you've got a credit card over here for $10,000, you've got one over here for $20,000, eventually you're going to reach $20,000 and you've got to keep paying this thing off. But the amount of interest that you're paying on credit card number one is higher, and the amount of money that you've got going on this credit card will reduce significantly because the interest payments will cover off what you've got there on the serviceability. So you're taking from Peter to pay Paul, and it's really not something that's very sustainable. When you look at if you click into here, they've got state debt clocks and world debt clocks. I'll just show you into the world debt clocks for a second. So China is by far the worst, followed by China and Japan. Interestingly, Japan's economy has been in the doldrums since the late 1980s, early 1990s for a variety of different reasons, but mostly because of demographics and their aging population. We all know that Japanese have a really long life expectancy. They live into their 90s, for heaven's sake, and there's just not enough people replacing their population to bring in the tax revenue to solve that problem. All countries in the world have that. And there's a big debate here in Australia at the moment about having a large Australia. And in the next 2 years, they were talking about importing 715,000 new immigrants here to Australia. And that's a real big problem here because we don't have the infrastructure to support that. We don't have the housing, we don't have the schools, the hospitals, and all of the transport facilities to support massive growth like that. And the problem that we face is if we don't import those people and we don't bring that skilled labor here to Australia, our debt to GDP ratio goes down and our economy will start to come undone because there's just not enough people here. But the problem that the government has is there's not enough people here and there's not enough services to cover off the people that they want to bring here. because we can solve the problem of not enough people. We just open up the gates and let more in, which is not necessarily a bad thing in a big place like Australia, and it creates more opportunity and whatnot, but it has like a lot of negative effects in our economy that don't seem to be covered off on or well understood by politicians. So if we look at the Australian population and what's going on here, I think this number is pretty telling as well, how big your population is versus the debt to GDP ratio. So whether that's public debt or external debt, so this is the aggregation of everything in a country here. So if you look at the United States, this external one is pretty bad as well, which means the companies and business in the United States is in debt to other countries around the world, not just internally. So this is a really interesting chart, but this one here is a pretty scary number, right? How long is this going to go on before the whole world implodes? If you don't know, folks, no fiat currency in history has ever survived. Ever, never, ever. None, zero, nada. None of them has survived, and this one is no different. This is not going to survive either. We just happen to be living through a time where the economy is coming to an end. So there's another one here, the Australian debt clock as well, just gives you some slightly different numbers and some different aggregations of what's happening. And it's funny when you collapse the actual, so I collapse it there and I expand here for more information about credit. Down the bottom of it here, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can't see it, just shows the numbers of zeros and it says thousands, millions, billions, trillions, because it's pretty hard to actually recognize those numbers. And how many zeros is that? Like, so 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 zeros. What the hell? This number, this chart down the bottom here really kind of shows a story here. A lot of people have said that the world's economy is coming to an end in the 2020s, but the reality is the world's economy came to an end here in September 2007 during the GFC. When the GFC happened between 2007 and 2009, you can see this as this chart here is kind of going up and down and ranging a little bit. Then all of a sudden it spikes up here. So that's where government debt really took off. And most financial charts you look at really tell the same story. It doesn't matter what the chart is. What matters is the time frame. In that 2007 to 2009 time frame, we see this massive hockey stick of money printing and growth. And the world's economy has really been on life support since. And until that had happened, everything was sort of under control and manageable. But then we had this giant shock because of the Glass-Steagall Act and the way that the GFC actually came to be. There was a giant shock in the economy that caused all of these things. Now, why does any of that matter, and how does any of this US national debt impact you? So this is a big news story where the US Congress are continuously arguing about should they be raising the debt ceiling or no. And they came out just the other day and said they came to a resolution which was going to reduce government spending, which would reduce the debt, and which would allow them to raise the debt clock or raise the debt ceiling rather, and it would fix the problems that are going to arise. But you would know that from time to time, periodically throughout the year, the government gets shut down because they're arguing with each other so much about this. But the reality is, if they don't raise the debt ceiling, the whole country will implode and collapse. Now, the reason that this matters to you folks is because of inflation, because the way that the country monetizes the debt that it actually has is by printing more money. And the only thing, folks, that causes inflation is when there's more money in the economy. It's got nothing to do with the war in Europe with Vladimir Putin or oil prices. Nothing at all. It's got to do with more money in the economy. And any politician or reserve bankster that says to you, oh, that's because of the war in Ukraine or something else, is just completely incorrect. That shows that they don't understand how basic economics works. And this is a great chart, and I'll put all of these links down in the description below in the show notes today, folks, so you can have a look for yourself. I was running a little bit late to the show today because I was looking at these charts, which is pretty interesting. So Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Sudan are the basket cases of the world, 1, 2, and 3. So Zimbabwe has inflation of 284%. So this data is pretty current. So you can see debt to GDP ratio worldwide, 66.4%. And I was mentioning before that the IMF said that anything below 60% is pretty good. So we see the world average is actually a little bit higher than what the recommendation is. And the global average for inflation is 13.9%. But don't believe what your government tells you, folks, because the basket of goodies that they use and they measure to measure inflation is something that they manipulate. So they're manipulating what goes in that basket of goodies. And I promise you that I go to the local Woolworths up the road here in Cronulla buy 2 bags of groceries that are only like not even full each bag, maybe half full each, and it cost me 50 or $60.